Acts chapter 25, verse 13. While you're turning there, last time we saw the next part of Paul's trial before Festus. Now he's the new governor of Judea. And we talked about how the world persecutes Christians in a couple ways. Falsely is one way, and for Christ's sake is the other. And so the new governor, there's a new trial, but Paul's still innocent, still no evidence against him. Once again, proving Christians are not supposed to be criminals. We should be models in every area of life. We should be model citizens, model employees, model husbands and wives, model students, whatever it is. We should be the example for others to follow. And so Festus, you remember, had tried to compromise with Paul and tried to move the trial back to Jerusalem to appease the Jews and said, I'll oversee it, I'll be the Roman authority there, but we'll take it back to them. And Paul refuses, and he exercises his right as a Roman citizen and appeals to the higher court. He appeals to Caesar. Now Paul isn't afraid to die. He actually says, if I've done anything wrong, go ahead and kill me. If I'm guilty, I'll take that punishment there. But if not, then he'll stand before Caesar. That was a really bold move on his part, because the current Caesar is now Nero. And as we said last time, that guy's a nut bar with a capital N. I mean, he's just unstable and a seditious and vindictive person, a crazy person actually. But Paul knows he's in God's hands. He's not in Caesar's hands, and so he's not afraid of that. And so he appeals to him. And so this is in the transition between Festus's trial and Caesar. It's the period in between that. And we're going to see another person here in this instance this evening, Herod Agrippa II. And here he's called just Agrippa, or King Agrippa. And look at verse 13. We'll read all the way down. We'll include three verses in chapter 26, or excuse me, 3 in chapter 26 also. But Acts 25:13, he says, And after certain days King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to salute Festus. And when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king, saying, There is a certain man left in bonds by Felix, about whom when I was in Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. To whom I answered, It is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die, before that he which is accused have the accusers face to face, and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. Therefore, when they were come hither, without any delay on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat, and commanded the man to be brought forth. Against whom, when the accusers stood up, they brought none accusations of such things as I supposed, but had certain questions against him of their own superstition, and of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these matters. But when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear the man myself. Tomorrow, and said he, thou shalt hear him. And on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice with great pomp, and was entered into the place of hearing with the chief captains and principal men of the city, at Festus's commandment Paul was brought forth. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, ye see this man, about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself hath appealed to Augustus, I have determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore I brought him forth before you, and especially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination had, I might have somewhat to write. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, Thou art permitted to speak for thyself. Then Paul stretched forth the hand and answered for himself, I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because I shall answer for myself this day before thee, touching all the things whereof I am accused of the Jews, especially because I know thee to be an expert in all customs and questions which are among the Jews. Wherefore I beseech thee to hear me patiently. Now, we'll continue that portion next time, but we're going to have to break this down. It's about 50 verses or so, this hearing before Agrippa, and so we'll put that in a little smaller pieces. But Paul has already been proven innocent 4 times. 4 times he has been proven innocent. And Festus, you remember, tried to downgrade his case back to the Jews because this seems to be a religious matter. And he doesn't know anything about those things. And he says, well, the religious things would be best handled by the Sanhedrin Council. And he says, we'll take you back there, have their court, I'll oversee it. And of course, Paul refused, appealed to Caesar. And now they're just waiting to transfer him to Rome for his trial there. And so this is another person along the chain here in these verses that he gets to speak before, and it's King Agrippa. Now, Festus has the same problem that Claudius Lysias. You remember that was the chief captain at Fort Antonia. And he had the same problem. In order to send a person up the chain, there has to be some kind of legitimate accusation against them. You can't just keep taking an innocent person and forcing them on up to a higher court. The chief captain had an out, though. Right? Because even though he didn't have any accusations or legitimate accusations of crimes, he justified the transfer of Paul to Caesarea because there were 4 attempts on Paul's life in 2 days' time while he was under his care. And so he can justify that transfer because Paul's life is in danger. And so, but Felix didn't have anything there. But how many attempts on Paul's life were there in the 2 years that he was under the governor Felix's care? None. And Paul hadn't appealed to Caesar yet at that time, so he didn't have to transfer him on up the chain. And so he's been removed. Festus has now replaced him, but Festus has nothing there. He has just been appointed by Caesar to this position of governor of Judea. And now he's going to have to send a prisoner to his court with no charges laid against him. Now, how incompetent is that guy going to seem to Caesar? He's just put him into office, and the first thing he does is send him a criminal to his court for him to have to deal with, and there are no charges against him. That's going to make him look really bad. And so he's hoping to find something here. And that's where Agrippa comes in. Agrippa has experience with the Jews. He's been involved in leadership in this part of the world for some time. And so he's hoping he can help him. Back in verse 13 there, he says, and after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to salute Festus. Now, this is where Agrippa shows up. And it seems like a kind of a courtesy call. This is a neighboring leader here, Roman ruler there, and he is an up-and-comer, though. And I brought a couple maps to say to him just to show you what's going on. And you can see this is Herod Agrippa II. Right? This little area up here in the red, Chassis, that is where he was the ruler of. Right? That's where he was the ruler of. He has since been upgraded, and you see these portions in yellow. That's what he's the ruler of now. And so he's made a significant progress there, an upgrade. Caesar has assigned him to this area. Can you see these areas here in the light green? It's got that orange border around it right there on the west side of the Sea of Galilee, and then here down on the east side of the Dead Sea. He's later going to get those areas also. Right? And so his territory that he's ruling over is expanding. And so you see when he comes to, this is the area that Festus is over. Now, You see, this guy keeps wanting to get more and more leadership, more and more territory. I don't think this is really just a social call. I think this guy hopes that at some point he can be the ruler of all of it, right? And so that's kind of the way I see this going there. But he comes down and he's just spending some time. And he's one of the Herods, the descendants of Herod the Great. And they did have a lot of experience dealing with the Jews, over the years. And so Festus thinks that Agrippa can help him in this area with Paul. And so he does consult with him. There in verse 14, he says, "And when he had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king, saying, There is a certain man left in bonds by Felix." Now, normally we would associate a king as someone who is superior to a governor. Festus is the governor of this area, Judea. And Agrippa is the king of this area in the yellow. And so you'd think, by the title that one would be superior to the other. And I'm going to show you another map. Now this is before this time. And this is actually the border. Everything bordered in black is Herod the Great's territory. He was the first Herod, and extends on over this one. But all of these areas were under Herod the Great. And after he died, his sons took over the rule of these different areas there. Archelaus was over this area that Festus is over right now. And Herod Antipas was over these two orange areas, and Philip the Tetrarch, he was over those areas. Now Archelaus was over this area. He was a horrible ruler. And he actually had the title of king. They were all kings at that time. He had the title of king stripped from him. And so he was actually just an ethnarch, basically a ruler at that time. And then eventually he had the whole territory removed from him, and Caesar replaced them with just a proconsul, which is a governor, just a general type of leader. And it's been that way ever since. There's been a governor. Pilate was a governor. Felix was a governor. Festus was a governor. That's just a general title there. And so, but it was a title of honor, and that was given them by the real king of Rome. And the reason he wasn't reluctant to give them that title is because the king of Rome doesn't go by the title king, does he? What does he go by? Well, he's the emperor or the Caesar. That's the title he goes by. And so king is actually under that title there. And so just to show you kind of where Herod Agrippa II comes in, this is the family tree of the Herods there. And Herod Agrippa II is the last one. The last one. Started with Herod the Great. That's back in Luke 1 and 2 and Matthew 2. That's when Jesus was born. He's the Herod there that the wise men came and visited. But you see down here at the bottom, when you see Herod Agrippa II, here called King Agrippa, you see how the family tree is? He is the son of Herod Agrippa I. Who are these two people? No. Sisters. He's a son. Bernice is a sister. Drusilla is a sister. Drusilla is the one that was the wife of the governor Felix beforehand. Okay, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. Just so you know, Herod Agrippa II, Bernice, and Drusilla, they're all brothers and sisters there. And so, but as you see here, Bernice in quotation marks says wife. Right. Now, Herod Agrippa II and Bernice are living in incest as husband and wife. They're brother and sister. Right. Herod Agrippa the First, just to give you a little background on that, he is the Herod in the book of Acts. There are a couple exceptions there. He's not the one in chapter 4:27. He's not the one mentioned in 13:1. Those refer to Herod Antipas up here. But the rest of those in Acts refer to him, and he was this guy's father. He is the one who had James killed and Peter put in prison back in Acts chapter 5. He's also the one who had the big birthday celebration in honor of Caesar, stood up to give his little speech, and you remember the people were trying to honor him, and he says, "Oh no, it's not the voice of a man, it's the voice of a God." And you remember, instead of shunning that type of praise, he accepted that, and God struck him. He was eaten with worms and died a few days later after that, a very gruesome and painful death. His uncle, Herod Agrippa's uncle, was Herod Antipas. He's the one who stole Philip's wife. That's his brother's wife, Herodias. You remember them because John the Baptist condemned their marriage, and John the Baptist was put in prison. You remember Herodias' daughter, she danced for them at a festival there, and you remember he agreed to give her whatever she'd asked for, and the mom says, "Oh, get John the Baptist's head in a basket. That's what we'll ask for." And he reluctantly did it. And of course, Philip's the other brother there. But Agrippa's great-grandfather here, that was Herod the Great. And as we said before, he's the one that had all the babies under 2 years old killed in Bethlehem after the wise men visited. And so that's the family tree there, as ugly as it is. And so the whole family is just eat up with all kinds of just vile, sinful, disgusting things. So much so, when you have so much of that going on in one family and every generation after generation, eventually what happens? They kind of act like that's normal. They kind of act like that's, the way it should be. And so, like we said, even though in Scripture Bernice isn't technically listed as Agrippa's wife, Josephus and other historians from that time confirm that they were living in that kind of relationship. We do see in our text that she is always there. She's always with him. Here in Acts 25:13, he says, "And after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to salute Festus." Down in verse 23, the same chapter, he says, "And on the morrow when Agrippa was come, and Bernice with great pomp, and was entered into the place of hearing with the chief captains and principal men of the city at Festus' commandment, Paul was brought." And you skip ahead to Acts 26:30, he says, "And when he had thus spoken, the king rose up, and the governor, and Bernice, and they that sat with them." And so Agrippa has attached himself to his own sister in this sinful relationship. And she's become his lover. She's become like a helpmate, like a wife, but it's still incest. It's still wrong. And I believe it's a hindrance to him being saved, because what's one of the first requirements for salvation? Repentance. Repentance. A person has to turn from sin. Now, when we say that, that doesn't mean that a person has to clean their life up before they can be saved. God commendeth His love toward us, and while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So, it doesn't say, a person has to fix all their ugly little problems and get rid of all those things. But they have to have a desire to. God will help them get rid of those things, but the desire has to be there. If a person doesn't want to turn from sin, they haven't repented. They can't be saved yet until they get to that point. And so, back in Acts 25, verse 14 and 15, they have a little communion time together, Agrippa and Festus. It says, and when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king, saying, there is a certain man left in bonds by Felix, about whom when I was at Jerusalem the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. You remember as soon as he's been in Caesarea 3 days, he goes up to Jerusalem to try to make nice with the Jews, and the first thing they bring up is, hey, let's take care of this Paul thing. All right, let's get this guy killed. Let's get him done there. And so Festus is telling Agrippa here how Paul has kind of just been dropped in his lap. He was from Felix's rule, and how the Jews are very adamant about getting him convicted. Verse 16 there he says, to whom I answered, it is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die, before that he which is accused have the accusers face to face, and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. And that's what Festus did. Festus brought them down to Caesarea. They held the trial, and Festus understands you can't just convict a person without a trial, without any proper evidence, or without just cause. And so the Jews were pushing that, and so he agreed to hear the case. But here's the problem, Acts 25, 17 and 18. He says, therefore, when they were come hither without any delay on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought forth, against whom when the accusers stood up, they brought none accusation of such things as I supposed. Now, he thought they were going to have some kind of legitimate claim against Paul there. That's the same thing the chief captain thought. Remember, he finds them beating Paul up there at the Temple Mount, trying to kill him, and he drags him in there and thinks he's what? That Egyptian leading the group of assassins. And he says, no, I'm no person of any mean city. I'm not. I'm a Jew. I haven't done anything like that. And so, Acts 25:19, he says, but had certain questions against him of their own superstition, and of one Jesus which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Now, Festus doesn't really understand anything about the Jesus and the crucifixion and the resurrection. He knows it's a theological dispute, but he didn't understand it. He knows it's about a man named Jesus that Paul insisted to be alive even though he was killed. And so in Jesus' day, everybody knew about the crucifixion and the resurrection. Everybody did. Now, whether they believed it or not, they knew about it. Right? Now, this is just a few decades later, and now we have a high-ranking Roman official in this same area of Judea that has no idea who Jesus was. He has no idea. Look at verse 20 there. He says, and because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these matters. And you see, Festus didn't really believe that. He didn't really believe Jesus had been killed and resurrected, but he knew that this was a religious thing, and he defers to the religious experts, which would be the Sanhedrin Council, and that's when Paul refused. But verse 21, he says, but when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. Now, Augustus isn't a proper name, right? It's a title. Now, several of the emperors assumed that. It's Sebastos, which means the worshipped or revered one. That's what that title means. The official title of the current Caesar would be Augustus Caesar Nero. That's who the current Caesar is. You remember Octavius was the first Caesar to take that title, Augustus. He wanted to be worshipped like a god there, and several after him claimed that same title. And so they're talking about Nero here, even though they say that title that they love to be called by. Verse 22 says, then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, thou shalt hear him. This sounds interesting to Agrippa, and he agrees to hear the case. He's just curious, right? It's kind of like when Herod Antipas wanted the one up here, he wanted to see Jesus during his trial right before his crucifixion. You remember why he wanted to see Jesus? He was hoping he would do what? miracle. Oh, I've heard about all these miracles this guy does. Maybe I'll get to see one. And of course, it didn't turn out that way. But next we see the circumstances of this hearing. Look at chapter 25, verse 23. He says, "And on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice, with great pomp, and was entered into the place of hearing with the chief captains and principal men of the city, at Festus' commandment, Paul was brought forth." Now, Agrippa and Bernice come with great pomp. Now, this is a really elaborate fanfare. It's a big spectacle when they show up. It kind of reminds me of, any of y'all seen the cartoon movie Aladdin? Disney movie Aladdin, you know what I'm talking about? Okay. You know how some of you can probably remember. I know Sheila can, but you remember Aladdin is just a street rat is what they call him. just a bum, a thief actually. But he finds the genie's lamp and he makes the wish, you remember, and he wants to be a prince because he wants to court the princess, and she won't date anybody but a prince. And so he says, make me a prince. And he wasn't a prince. But remember, he comes into the palace there, and he's got all the elephants and the peacocks and this great big spectacle and the band and all those things going. Very impressive when he comes in, even for a cartoon movie, but all of that entourage. That's the way Agrippa and Bernice come in. When it says with great pomp, that's what it is. They want to be noticed. They want to be, it's a spectacle for them, and it's very majestic, very regal, and they want to be important and influential there. And so actually they want to be noticed more so than Festus. This is his territory, but they're drawing the attention to themselves there instead, and he wants everyone to think they're more important than Festus is. You probably seen people like this. You probably know people like this. There are some people that don't really have money, but they want people to think they've got money. Or they're not really talented, but they want people to think they're really talented, and things like that. And that's kind of the way they're equals. Agrippa and Festus, they're just leaders of a province. They're leaders of a province. One's not more important than the other. But Agrippa wants people to think he's more important, and so it's meant to command the respect of all, and maybe even intimidate some. I couldn't help but think of that restaurant that we went to that time at Myrtle Beach. Sheila and I did. We found this. They had, you get all these coupon books and all that kind of stuff, and they had this. What was it? 20% off or something like that in it. It was the golfer. But we had a coupon for it, and they said, "Oh, wow, we'll go." And it was like a steakhouse kind of thing. And I said, "Well, we'll go to the steakhouse, have a nice meal while we're down there." Our kids were still little. My brother Nathan was with us, and his wife, and we were down there, and so we go to this restaurant, and we open. It's got these great big, huge wooden doors, right? And we opened up this door and we walk in. We're in beach clothes. We've got shorts on, polos, that kind of stuff, Sheila's got... Well, yeah, you all did, but we just had beach stuff, shorts and that kind of stuff. But we opened the door, and there is 7 or 8 of these women that are in these formal gown-looking things. And they're all decked out, and everything's really lavish looking. They've got fancy cloth tablecloths and chairs and all that kind of stuff. And I said, "Oh no, we're out of our league. We don't want to eat." What is it? I wanted to walk right back out the door. I thought, there is no way that we're going to come in here in these kind of clothes and eat at this kind of place, And my brother said, "Oh, no, let's go ahead and eat. Our money's good as anybody else's." And I told Sheila, I said, "Okay." I remember whispering to her, I said, "This is going to sting." I knew it would, because everything looked expensive in there, and we sat down at the table and all these lavish furnishings, and like I say, everything. It looked like a formal dinner or something like that. And then we got the menu, and I was really intimidated because it had all the prices on it. But we went ahead and ate there. But it was really just fancy, and it was intimidating though, and that's kind of the way Agrippa and Bernice, that's when they present themselves here, they're meant to be intimidating and meant to be regal and those kind of things. Look at verse 24 there, Acts 25. He says, "And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, ye see this man, about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer." Now, imagine Bernice and Agrippa and all this fancy, regal entrance there, and Paul comes in. What's he wearing? Just a tunic or a robe, just common clothes, right? Just very plain, very simple, right? And Festus says, look at this guy. This is what all the Jews are all riled up about and want dead. Right? There's nothing special about him. Look at verse 25. He says, "But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I have determined to send him." And Festus says, "I've got nothing to write, no charges to write, no particulars, right? Just some vague, unproven accusations." Now look at verse 26 and 27. He says that, "Of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and especially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination had, I might have somewhat to write. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him." You notice there in verse 26, he says, "Of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord." Who's he talking about? He's talking about Caesar. Caesar wanted to be worshipped as Lord. That's who he's talking about there. And so, Paul doesn't even have to agree to this hearing. He's already made his appeal to Caesar. This won't be a trial. If they try to make it a trial, it'll be an illegal trial. He has already appealed to Caesar, and as a Roman citizen, they can't force him to even participate in this. Right? You remember the same thing happened with Jesus' trial. It was illegal to have any trial before daybreak. They arrested Jesus in the middle of the night, took him, had a trial before Annas, had a trial before Caius. Right at daybreak, they rushed the Sanhedrin in, had their vote, and rushed him right over to Pilate's house. The trials before daybreak were all illegal. They weren't allowed to have a trial before day. And if Jesus had protested, that would have stopped there. But Jesus knew that he was supposed to die. He didn't stop any of that. And so Paul doesn't either. He doesn't stop any of this. For one, this is going to be another chance for him to share the gospel. It means nothing as far as his trial is concerned. And what's interesting, when you have a big pomp and parade and all this celebration kind of thing for these two people here to come in for this trial, they've drawn a crowd. They've drawn some attention there. It's a big spectacle, and that's what he wanted, to draw attention to himself, and that's happened. Now, we don't see God have his people use those kind of gimmicks to draw big crowds. Now, sometimes God does draw crowds, right? But usually he uses other people to do that. Or he himself will do that sometimes. We know when Elijah had the showdown with the prophets of Baal, did Elijah draw that big crowd? No. Who drew the crowd? Well, it was the prophets of Baal. They were the ones that were the majority. They were the ones that had the crowd drawn there. And of course then Elijah gets to prove who God really is in that. And on the day of Pentecost, Peter was preaching there. The apostles didn't draw a crowd then. What drew the crowd? Remember when the Holy Spirit came, there wasn't a big storm or anything like that, but it was the sound of a mighty rushing wind. right? And when people heard that, what did they do? They all come together and said, what is that? We were out here before church, and I hear this. And I said, what is that? And I opened the door, and Josh was coming in. I said, what is that? The garbage truck backing up. That's the craziest backup beeper on a garbage truck I ever heard in my life. But, that's kind of the way it was on the day of Pentecost. It's a noise that they're not familiar with, and so they gathered there. But God did that. The apostles didn't do that. And so here we see the same thing. Paul didn't draw this crowd here. God has used this very prideful and vain man to draw the crowd here. And Paul just uses the opportunity to preach to them while he's there. Now look at chapter 26 and verse 1. We'll just kind of get started on this before we close. But he says, Then Agrippa said unto Paul, Thou art permitted to speak for thyself. Then Paul stretched forth the hand and answered for himself. Now Paul gets to speak for himself. But as we'll see, he doesn't actually speak for himself. He speaks for God instead there. We get lots of chances to talk. If we waste them on ourselves, how can we do God's work? That's what Paul wrote to Timothy, 2 Timothy 4:2. Preach the word, be instant, in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and doctrine. We're supposed to be instant. We're supposed to be ready all the time. Jesus did that all the time. All the time. He just took whatever circumstance was there and drew people to God through those circumstances. You remember the Samaritan woman? Why was she at the well in the middle of the day? Well, she had a horrible background, didn't she? She'd been married multiple times. She was living with a guy then. She didn't come when the rest of the women would be drawing water. She came in the middle of the day, right? And she needed water, though. She didn't want to be shamed by everybody else, but she still needed water, right? What did Jesus tell her? That he was the water of life. You could have a well of water springing up inside you. He was talking about eternal life, and he used the illustration of the well to show that to her. Right? When the crowds needed food, Jesus provided it. Right? Used a little boy's lunch at one time and fed 5,000 men plus women and children. And then after that, Jesus said what? I am the bread of life. I'm the bread of life. When he was teaching at the temple, they had the menorah there, the light stand there. And he said, I am the light of the world. Jesus taught at the Temple Mount several times, and I don't know if you know this or not, but the doors of the temple were decorated with vines, very elaborate golden vines. Josephus writes this way, describing it there. This is quoting. He says, The temple had doors also at the entrance and lintels over them of the same heights as the temple itself. They were adorned with embroidered veils and with flowers of purple and pillars interwoven over these. But under the crownwork was spread out a golden vine with its branches hanging down from a great height, the largeness and fine workmanship of which was a surprising sight to the spectators, to see what vast materials there were and with what great skill the workmanship was done. End quote. He was talking about those golden vines on that outer gate there at the Temple Mount, right? And they saw those doors and those massive golden vines hanging there and those beautiful branches. And at one point, Jesus tells his disciples, I am the vine, ye are the branches. And they're looking at those doors on the Temple Mount there. And so, he just used everyday things and turned them to something about God. And it's something that we have to learn to do. We have a lot of opportunities. Right? I like a lady on my mail route. I asked her, I said, how you doing? And she says, I'm blessed. I like that. Look at verse 2 there, Acts 26. He says, I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because I shall answer for myself this day before thee, touching all the things whereof I am accused of the Jews, especially because I know thee to be an expert in all customs and questions which are among the Jews, wherefore I beseech thee to hear me patiently. Now, Paul's happy to get the answer before Agrippa. Once again, this is not flattery, right? He is an expert in customs and questions among the Jews. He's been around a while, Agrippa has. He knows all about those things. He knows the history of the Jewish people. He knows about Jesus. He knows about the crucifixion there. And so he says, I'm happy to answer before you. Right? He's not green. Festus is green. He doesn't know about Jesus. He doesn't know about those religious things. And so Agrippa does. And so he'll be a good one to hear this case. But Paul isn't actually going to defend himself. It's going to be an offensive assault when he actually gets into this trial. Right? Because he's going to be the one pursuing them with the gospel. He's going to make them make a choice about whether to accept Christ or not. And so we'll continue this, the Lord willing, next week. But any questions or comments so far?